The snow fell heavy on Fort Apache that December morning in 1882, blanketing the compound in an eerie silence broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Lieutenant James McCready had seen plenty of hardship during his 3 years on the frontier, but nothing prepared him for what stood before him at the fort's gates. She was barely more than a skeleton wrapped in tattered deer hide, her dark eyes sunken but burning with desperate determination. In her trembling arms, she clutched a bundle so small it could barely be called a baby. The Apache woman's lips moved soundlessly at first, then found their voice in broken English that cut through the winter air like a blade. "I can eat the rats, sir. Please just feed my baby real food." Would one soldier's moment of mercy spark a chain of events that could change the course of two warring peoples forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lieutenant James McCready stood frozen in the gateway, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter December air. The Apache woman's words echoed in his mind, each syllable carrying the weight of desperation that transcended the language barrier between their peoples. In his 3 years stationed at Fort Apache, he had witnessed the brutal reality of frontier warfare, but nothing had prepared him for this moment of raw humanity. The tarnished bronze medal pinned to his uniform caught the pale morning light, a commendation for his service in the Indian Wars, awarded for what his superiors called distinguished conduct in the pacification of hostile tribes. Now, staring into the sunken eyes of this starving mother, the weight of that medal felt like a millstone around his neck. McCready's own story began in the cramped tenements of Boston, where his Irish immigrant parents had struggled to feed their 5 children. His father, Seamus, had worked the docks until consumption claimed his lungs, leaving his mother, Brigid, to scrub floors in wealthy households just to keep food on their table. James had enlisted at 17, not out of patriotic fervor, but because the army promised 3 meals a day and a steady wage to send home. The frontier had hardened him in ways he never expected. He had seen Apache warriors fall beneath cavalry sabers, witnessed the aftermath of raids on settler homesteads, and participated in the systematic destruction of Apache camps. Each action was justified by military doctrine, each order followed without question. Yet standing before this woman, McCready felt the careful walls he had built around his conscience beginning to crumble. Behind him he could hear the stirring of the fort as soldiers emerged from their barracks for morning roll call. Sergeant O'Malley's voice carried across the compound, barking orders with practiced authority. Soon Captain Morrison would make his rounds, inspecting the perimeter and noting any irregularities in the daily routine. An Apache woman standing at the gates would certainly qualify as an irregularity. The baby in her arms stirred weakly, its tiny face pale and drawn with hunger. McCready had seen that same expression on his youngest sister's face during the harsh winter of 1869, when his mother's wages weren't enough to buy sufficient food. His sister had survived that winter, but barely, and the memory of her fragile cries still haunted his dreams. "Please, sir," the woman whispered again, her voice barely audible above the wind. "My baby dying." McCready glanced around the compound. Most of the soldiers were still focused on their morning duties, but Private Jenkins near the quartermaster's building had noticed the commotion and was walking their way. Time was running short. The regulations were clear. No unauthorized contact with Apache indigenous, no aid or comfort to be provided without direct orders from superior officers. Violation of these orders could result in court-martial, imprisonment, or worse. Captain Morrison had made his position crystal clear during McCready's first week at the fort. The only good Apache is a dead Apache, and anyone who thinks otherwise is welcome to join them in hell. Yet as McCready looked at the baby's threadbare blanket, a piece of cloth so worn it was more holes than fabric, he saw his own sister wrapped in their grandmother's shawl, shivering in their cold tenement room. The blanket represented everything this mother had left of her previous life, her last connection to a world that had been systematically destroyed by men like him. His hand moved instinctively to his coat pocket, where he kept a small piece of hardtack from breakfast. It wasn't much, but it might buy this baby another day of life. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about military discipline and chain of command, but a deeper voice, one that sounded remarkably like his mother's gentle Irish brogue, whispered about the sacred duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. Private Jenkins was getting closer, his curiosity clearly piqued by the unusual scene at the gates. In moments, the decision would be taken out of McCready's hands entirely. The Apache woman seemed to sense the urgency of the moment, her eyes pleading not just for food, but for recognition of their shared humanity. McCready's fingers closed around the hardtack in his pocket, feeling its rough texture against his palm. Such a small thing, really, a piece of dried bread and meal that would be forgotten by evening. Yet in this moment, it represented the difference between hope and despair, between life and death, for an innocent child who had committed no crime except being born into a world torn apart by hatred and fear. The bronze medal on his chest seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, its weight pressing against his heart like an accusation. He had earned it by following orders without question, by treating the enemy as less than human. Now, faced with undeniable proof of their humanity, he had to choose between the medal's cold authority and the warming voice of his conscience. McCready made his decision in the space of a heartbeat. He pulled the hardtack from his pocket and stepped closer to the Apache woman, blocking Private Jenkins's view with his body. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, breaking off a piece of the dried bread. "Ayana," she whispered. The word, carrying the musical quality of her native tongue, means eternal blossom. The irony wasn't lost on him, a woman named for eternal flowering, now withered by starvation and desperation. She accepted the hardtack with trembling fingers and immediately began softening it with her saliva before carefully placing tiny portions on her baby's lips. "How old?" McCready asked, watching the infant's weak attempts to take nourishment. "7 moons," Ayana replied, her English halting but clear. "Born in summer when world was green. The baby couldn't have weighed more than 10 pounds. Far too small for 7 months of life. Its skin stretched tight over tiny bones, and its breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps that spoke of a body fighting a losing battle against starvation." From her tattered clothing, Ayana produced a small leather pouch, weathered and stained, but carefully maintained. Inside, McCready glimpsed dried herbs and what looked like small roots, remnants of traditional Apache medicine that had sustained her people for generations. "Medicine plants," she explained, seeing his curiosity, "but baby too weak. Need food first, medicine after." Harrison emerged from the infirmary at that moment, drawn by some instinct that told him medical attention was needed. The post-surgeon was a weathered man in his 50s, who had seen more suffering than any person should endure, yet his eyes still held compassion that military life hadn't managed to extinguish. "Lieutenant?" Dr. Harrison approached cautiously, taking in the scene with a practiced medical gaze. "Doctor, this woman's baby is starving. Could you take a look?" Dr. Harrison glanced around nervously, clearly aware of the regulations they were violating, but his medical oath won out over military protocol. He knelt beside Ayana and gently examined the infant with the careful hands of a man who understood that healing transcended politics. "Severe malnutrition," he murmured after a moment. "Dehydration, possible pneumonia developing. This child needs immediate care. What can we do?" McCready asked. "Warm milk, if we can get it. Small amounts, frequently. Clean water. Shelter from this cold." Dr. Harrison looked up at McCready. "And prayers, Lieutenant. Lots of prayers." Private Jenkins had finally reached them, his young face confused by the unusual gathering at the fort's entrance. "Is there a problem here?" McCready turned to face the private, his mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't immediately result in arrests all around. "The doctor is examining a potential health threat to the fort, Private. Please continue with your duties." It was a weak excuse, but Jenkins nodded and moved away. though McCready noticed him glancing back with obvious curiosity. "We can't stay here," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "Captain Morrison will be making his rounds soon." Ayana had been following their conversation with the careful attention of someone whose life depended on understanding the intentions of those around her. Her English might be limited, but her intelligence was sharp. "I go," she said simply. "You give baby food, I go away." The words hit McCready like a physical blow. This mother was willing to abandon her child to ensure its survival, the ultimate sacrifice wrapped in quiet dignity. "No," he said firmly, "we'll find another way." Dr. Harrison was already thinking ahead. The old storage room behind the infirmary, it's warm, private. I could tend to the baby there without drawing attention. That's directly violating orders, Doctor. So is letting an infant die when we have the means to help. Dr. Harrison's voice carried the authority of a man who had seen too much preventable suffering. "I took an oath, Lieutenant." "Did you?" McCready thought of his commission, of the oath he had sworn to defend the Constitution and obey the orders of those appointed over him. But he also thought of deeper promises to his mother, to his own conscience, to the God his Irish Catholic upbringing had taught him, watched over all his children, regardless of the color of their skin. "We'll need milk," he said quietly. "I can get that from the cook. Tell him it's for medical purposes." Ayana watched this exchange with growing hope, tempered by years of disappointment. In her medicine pouch, alongside the traditional herbs, she carried memories of her destroyed village, of the husband who died defending their home, of the long journey through winter wilderness that had brought her to this desperate moment. The baby stirred in her arms, making a sound too weak to be called a cry. Its tiny hand, no bigger than McCready's thumb, grasped reflexively at the air, seeking comfort that only survival could provide. "We do this quietly," McCready said to Dr. Harrison. "No one else knows, unless absolutely necessary." "Understood." As they began moving toward the infirmary, Ayana spoke once more, her voice carrying a dignity that starvation couldn't diminish. "Thank you," she said in perfect English, the words clearly learned for this exact moment. "My baby, remember kindness." As Dr. Harrison settled Ayana and her baby in the hidden storage room, she closed her eyes and let the memories wash over her like a summer rain. 7 months ago, the world had been different. 7 months ago, she had been Ayana, wife of Nalnish, keeper of the evening fire, mother to a growing child in her belly, and guardian of generations of wisdom passed down through her grandmother's line. Their village had nestled in a valley where the river ran clear and the cottonwoods provided shade during the harsh summer months. Nalnish had been a respected warrior and hunter, his skills providing not just for their family, but for the elderly and the children whose fathers had fallen in the endless conflicts with the white soldiers. He crafted arrows with the precision of a master, each shaft perfectly straight, each point napped from obsidian, with an edge sharper than any metal knife. One such arrow now lay broken in Ayana's medicine pouch, snapped in half the night their world ended. She had found it, clutched in Nalnish's lifeless hand, its ceremonial eagle feathers stained with his blood. The arrow had been a gift from his father, carried into every hunt and every battle as a symbol of their family's honor. When Nalnish fell defending their lodge from the cavalry raid, the arrow broke beneath his weight, its two halves as shattered as Ayana's heart. The soldiers had come at dawn, as they always did. The sound of hoofbeats had awakened the camp, just as the first light touched the mountains, but by then it was too late to run. Captain Morrison himself had led that raid, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat, as he shouted orders that Ayana couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear in the language of violence. Nalnish had pushed her toward the back of their lodge, one hand on her swollen belly, the other reaching for his bow. "Take only what you need," he had whispered urgently. "Follow the river north. Find the old woman's cave." But Ayana had frozen, watching through a gap in the hide walls as soldiers surrounded their home. She saw Mrs. Yazzie, the old storyteller, fall beneath a saber's edge. She saw young Hastin, barely 16, try to protect his younger sister and die for his courage. She saw the flames begin to consume everything her people had built. "Go," Nalnish had shouted, and this time she obeyed, crawling through the tear he cut in the back wall of their lodge. She had looked back once to see him standing in their doorway, his bow drawn, his face set with the calm determination of a man who knew he would not survive the day, but refused to die without honor. The broken arrow was all she had left of him. The journey north had been a nightmare of pain and fear. Her baby had been born beside a frozen stream during the worst blizzard in memory, with only her grandmother's teachings to guide her through the agony of childbirth in the wilderness. No midwife, no warm lodge, no celebration to welcome the new life into the world. Just snow and wind and the terrible knowledge that this infant's first breath might be among its last. She had wrapped the baby in her own clothing, then in strips torn from her deer-hide dress, creating the threadbare blanket that now served as the child's only protection against the cold. For 3 months, she had wandered the frozen landscape, following game trails and avoiding the settlements where white families lived in the warm houses her people would never see. The baby had been strong at first, nursing eagerly and growing, despite their harsh circumstance. But as Ayana's own body weakened from hunger and exposure, her milk had gradually diminished until it barely sustained life. She had tried everything, chewing pine nuts to make a paste the baby could swallow, melting snow in her mouth to provide water, even catching mice when desperation overcame her revulsion. It was the rats that had finally driven her to the fort. She had found them in an abandoned homestead, frozen but still fresh enough to eat. As she gnawed the tough meat, forcing herself to swallow what her stomach wanted to reject, she realized she would do anything, eat anything, if it meant her baby could have real food. Clean milk, warm bread, the simple nourishment that white children took for granted. The broken arrow in her pouch had been her constant reminder that some sacrifices were worth making, that honor sometimes meant accepting help from those who had destroyed everything you loved. Nalnish had died protecting their family's future, and that future now rested in this tiny bundle of failing life that represented all of her people's hopes and dreams. Harrison's gentle ministrations brought her back to the present as he carefully examined the baby with instruments she had never seen before. The child seemed so small in this strange room filled with white man's medicine, but for the first time in months, Ayana allowed herself to hope that her husband's sacrifice might not have been in vain. Captain Jeremiah Morrison's boots echoed sharply against the wooden planks of his office floor. As he paced behind his desk, the official telegram from Territorial Command crumpled in his weathered fist. The paper bore the territorial seal and explicit instructions regarding Apache prisoners that left no room for interpretation or mercy. All Apache individuals encountered within territorial boundaries are to be considered hostile combatants until proven otherwise. No aid, comfort, or quarter shall be provided without express written authorization from Territorial Command. Violations of this directive will result in immediate court-martial proceedings. Morrison had requested these orders himself after the massacre at Willow Creek, where Apache raiders had killed an entire family of settlers, including 3 children under the age of 10. The images from that scene were burned into his memory, small bodies that would never grow up, dreams that would never be fulfilled, because he had hesitated to act decisively against the Apache threat. He spread the telegram flat on his desk, its creases forming harsh lines across the official letterhead. This piece of paper represented more than military policy to Morrison. It was his shield against the soft-hearted sentimentality that got good soldiers killed and innocent civilians massacred. Every time he looked at it, he remembered his promise to the graves at Willow Creek that such a tragedy would never happen again on his watch. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Enter." Sergeant O'Malley stepped inside, his face carefully neutral but his posture tense with unspoken concerns. "Sir, there's been some unusual activity around the infirmary this morning. Harrison has been making frequent trips to the supply depot, requesting milk and other provisions for what he calls medical purposes." Morrison's eyes narrowed. Dr. Harrison was a good man and a competent physician, but he had always been too sympathetic to the Apache for Morrison's taste. During their first meeting 3 years ago, the doctor had actually suggested establishing peaceful relations with the local tribes through medical assistance and cultural exchange. Morrison had quickly disabused him of such naive notions. What kind of provisions? Milk, soft bread, clean blankets? The cook mentioned that the doctor seemed unusually urgent about it all. Morrison drummed his fingers on the desk, his mind working through the possibilities. Harrison's supplies could be for any number of legitimate medical purposes. But the sergeant's tone suggested something more concerning. "Have you investigated further?" "Not yet, sir. I thought you should know first." "Good thinking, Sergeant. I'll handle this personally." As O'Malley turned to leave, Morrison called after him. "Sergeant, remind the men that anyone providing unauthorized assistance to hostile forces will face the full consequences of military justice. No exceptions." "Yes, sir." After O'Malley left, Morrison retrieved his service revolver from its holster and checked the cylinder. 6 rounds, more than enough to handle any situation that might arise. He had learned during his 22 years in the army that problems ignored had a tendency to grow into disasters. And disasters in Apache territory had a way of ending with good soldiers in pine boxes. He walked across the compound with purposeful strides, noting the way some of the younger soldiers averted their eyes as he passed. Guilt was written across their faces like words on a page, and Morrison felt his suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Someone had violated his direct orders, and he was going to find out who. The infirmary appeared normal from the outside, but Morrison noticed fresh footprints in the snow leading around to the back of the building. He followed the tracks to a door he rarely visited, the entrance to the old storage room that Dr. Harrison used for supplies. Morrison pressed his ear to the door and heard the unmistakable sound of a woman speaking in the Apache language, her voice soft and rhythmic, as if singing a lullaby. His hand moved instinctively to his revolver, as 22 years of military training took over. He had seen this kind of situation before. Well-meaning soldiers thinking they could help the enemy, not understanding that today's starving Apache woman could be tomorrow's intelligence source for raiders, planning to attack the fort. Sentiment was a luxury that frontier commanders couldn't afford, a weakness that had cost more lives than Morrison cared to count. The woman's voice continued, punctuated now by what sounded like an infant's weak cry. Morrison's jaw tightened as he realized the full scope of the situation. Not just an Apache woman, but a child as well. The regulations were explicit about such cases. Apache children grew up to become Apache warriors, and the only way to ensure lasting peace was to eliminate the threat before it could mature. Morrison drew his revolver and carefully turned the door handle. Whatever misguided mercy had led to this situation was about to end, and if that meant court-martialing half his command to restore discipline, so be it. The telegram in his pocket rustled softly as he prepared to enforce the orders that had been written in the blood of innocent settlers. The door opened silently, revealing a scene that would force Morrison to choose between the letter of military law and something far more complicated than the regulations had ever contemplated. Morrison stepped into the storage room and froze, his revolver half raised, as the scene before him shattered every assumption he had made. Dr. Harrison knelt beside Ayanna, carefully feeding the baby with a makeshift bottle fashioned from a medicine vial. Lieutenant McCready stood guard by the small window, watching for approaching soldiers. But what stopped Morrison cold was the sight of Sergeant O'Malley crouched near Ayanna, holding a simple tin ration container while she showed him how to warm milk properly for an infant. "Captain," McCready said quietly, straightening to attention but not moving away from the Apache woman and child. O'Malley scrambled to his feet, the tin container clutched in his weathered hand. The grizzled sergeant had served under Morrison for 8 years, through campaigns against the Comanche and Sioux, never once questioning an order or showing anything but absolute loyalty. Now he stood defiant, the ration tin held like a shield between himself and his commanding officer. "Sergeant, step away from the prisoners," Morrison commanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "She's not a prisoner, sir. She's a mother, trying to save her baby." The tin container caught the lamplight, its dented surface reflecting years of faithful service. It had held beans and hardtack through countless campaigns, shared among soldiers who understood that survival sometimes meant dividing meager rations with those who had less. Now it held warm milk for an Apache infant, transforming from a simple military utensil into something approaching sacred. Dr. Harrison continued his gentle ministrations, seemingly oblivious to the tension filling the small room. "The child's temperature is stabilizing," he reported clinically, "heart rate improving. With continued care, there's a real chance of recovery." "Doctor, you are in direct violation of territorial orders. All of you are." McCready stepped forward, positioning himself between Morrison and Ayanna. "Sir, we couldn't just watch a baby die. That baby is Apache, Lieutenant. Today's starving infant becomes tomorrow's warrior. You're not saving a life. You're preserving a future threat." Ayanna looked up from her child, her dark eyes meeting Morrison's gaze directly. She spoke no English words, but her expression communicated volumes. Here was a mother's love that transcended language, politics, and racial hatred. In her arms, the baby made soft sounds of contentment as it nursed from the improvised bottle. "Oh," cleared his throat, his Irish accent thickening with emotion. "Captain, I've got 3 grandchildren back in Boston. Little ones, sir, about this baby's age. And I'm thinking, if my daughter was starving and desperate, surrounded by enemies, wouldn't I want someone to show her mercy? Your grandchildren aren't Apache, Sergeant. No, sir, they're not, but they're babies just the same. And this little one hasn't hurt anybody. Hell, sir, it can't even hold its head up properly." Morrison holstered his revolver, but didn't relax his stance. The ration tin in O'Malley's hands seemed to pulse with significance, representing the fracture line running through his command. His sergeants were supposed to enforce discipline, not undermine it with sentimental gestures toward the enemy. "The regulations are clear, Sergeant. No aid or comfort to hostile forces." "Is she hostile, sir?" Dr. Harrison asked without looking up from his patient. "She came here alone, unarmed, asking for help. That doesn't sound like hostile behavior to me." Morrison studied Ayanna more carefully. She wore the traditional clothing of Apache women, but it was torn and patched, stained with months of desperate travel. No weapons were visible, no signs of deception or threat, just exhaustion, determination, and the fierce protective instinct of motherhood. "She could be a scout, gathering intelligence about our defenses." McCready shook his head. "Sir, look at her condition. She's been traveling for months, probably since the raids on the eastern settlements. She's barely alive herself. The only intelligence she could gather is how many of us still have functioning consciences." The rebuke hit Morrison harder than intended. He thought of the telegram in his pocket, of the explicit orders that denned every aspect of Apache relation. But he also thought of his own childhood in Pennsylvania, where his Methodist mother had taught him that mercy was a virtue that reflected God's own nature. "The baby's improving already," Dr. Harrison observed. "Amazing what a little nourishment can accomplish." O'Malley stepped closer to Morrison, still holding the ration tin like an offering. "Captain, I know the orders, but I also know right from wrong. And letting a baby starve when we've got the means to help, that's wrong, sir. Plain and simple." The tin container seemed to embody everything Morrison was struggling with: military duty versus human decency, following orders versus following conscience. In O'Malley's hands, it had become more than a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of shared humanity, proof that even in the midst of war, some things remained sacred. Morrison looked at each man in turn, seeing the resolve in their faces. They had made their choice, and they were prepared to face the consequence. The question now was whether he would enforce regulations that felt increasingly hollow, or find another way forward. Morrison's decision came swift and decisive, the way military training had taught him to respond to crisis situations. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a set of iron shackles, their metal surface dull with age and use. The restraints had seen service in a dozen frontier conflicts, binding prisoners and punishing insubordinate soldiers with equal efficiency. Lieutenant McCready, you are under arrest for violation of direct orders and providing aid to hostile forces. Dr. Harrison, Sergeant O'Malley, you will also be confined pending formal charges. The shackles clinked ominously as Morrison held them up, their weight familiar in his hands. He had used these same restraints on Apache prisoners after successful raids, on deserters caught fleeing their posts, on soldiers whose sympathies had led them to betray their duties. The iron was cold and unforgiving, representing the harsh justice that kept military discipline intact. McCready stepped forward, extending his wrists without resistance. I understand, sir, but I won't apologize for what we've done. Your conscience is noted for the record. Lieutenant, it will be considered during your court-martial. Morrison fastened the shackles around McCready's wrists with practiced efficiency, the metal clicking shut with finality. Dr. Harrison continued examining the baby, even as Morrison moved toward him with a second set of restraints. Captain, as the post's medical officer, I'm required to complete treatment of any patient under my care, military or civilian, friendly or hostile. The Hippocratic Oath takes precedence over territorial regulations. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't supersede military law, Doctor. Perhaps not, but it supersedes my willingness to let children die for political convenience. Morrison secured the shackles around Dr. Harrison's wrists, noting how the physician's hands remained steady despite his confinement. Even restrained, the doctor continued monitoring the baby's breathing, his medical training overriding the discomfort of his situation. Sergeant O'Malley presented the most difficult case. 20-year veterans didn't typically find themselves in shackles, and Morrison felt the weight of their shared history as he approached his most trusted non-commissioned officer. Sir, O'Malley said quietly, I followed you through hell and back, never questioned an order, never failed in my duty. But this isn't about military discipline anymore. This is about whether we're soldiers or monsters. Morrison hesitated, the shackles heavy in his hand. O'Malley's service record was exemplary. 8 years of faithful duty, 3 commendations for bravery, countless nights standing watch in hostile territory. Putting such a man in chains felt like betraying everything the army was supposed to represent. The regulations don't provide exceptions for good intentions, Sergeant. No, sir, they don't. But they also don't require us to abandon our humanity. The shackles clicked-clacked around O'Malley's wrists, but the sergeant continued standing at attention, his dignity intact, despite his circumstances. In his eyes, Morrison saw not defiance but disappointment, the look of a man who had expected better from his commanding officer. Ayanna watched these proceedings with growing alarm, understanding enough of the situation to realize that her presence had brought punishment upon the men who had shown her mercy. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice urgent with distress. She's saying it's her fault, Dr. Harrison translated, having learned some Apache during his time on the frontier. She wants to know if leaving will free us from punishment. Morrison looked at the Apache woman, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time, not as a threat or a political problem, but as a human being whose desperation had forced good men to choose between competing loyalties. The baby in her arms was alert now, its eyes bright with returning health, tiny fingers grasping at the warm air of the storage room. Tell her that leaving won't change what's already happened, Morrison said after a moment. Military justice doesn't work that way. McCready rattled his shackles experimentally, testing their security. Captain, when the court-martial convenes, will you testify that we acted with honor, even if we violated regulations? Honor doesn't excuse insubordination, Lieutenant. No, sir, but it explains it. Morrison studied the 3 shackled men, each representing a different aspect of military service. McCready embodied the idealistic young officer who believed duty meant protecting the innocent. Dr. Harrison represented professional ethics that transcended political boundaries. O'Malley stood for the veteran non-com, whose loyalty was tempered by hard-won wisdom about right and wrong. The punishment shackles had been intended to restore discipline and demonstrate the consequences of defying orders. Instead, they seemed to highlight the gap between military regulations and moral responsibility. The iron restraints couldn't bind conscience or change the fact that a dying baby was now thriving under their care. The hearing will convene tomorrow morning, Morrison. Until then, you'll be confined to quarters under guard. As he turned to leave, Morrison caught sight of the baby again. Such a small thing to cause such disruption, yet its innocent presence had shattered the careful order he had worked years to maintain. The shackles on his prisoners represented more than punishment. They symbolized his own conflict between duty and decency, between following orders and following his heart. The bronze church bell began to toll at precisely 11 o'clock, its deep resonant voice carrying across the prairie from the small town of Millbrook, 2 miles east of Fort Apache. Reverend Samuel Clark had been ringing that bell every hour since dawn, not for the time but as a call to witness, a summons for his congregation to gather and confront a moral crisis that had divided their community. Word of the Apache woman and her baby had spread through Millbrook like wildfire, carried by Private Jenkins, who had ridden into town the previous evening to purchase supplies. By morning, the story had transformed through multiple retellings, but the essential facts remained unchanged. Soldiers at the fort were facing court-martial for showing mercy to a starving mother and child. The bell's bronze surface bore the scratches and dents of 30 years of faithful service, cast in Philadelphia and transported west by wagon train when Millbrook was nothing but a surveyor's dream and a handful of determined family. It had called the faithful to worship through drought and plenty, had tolled for weddings and funerals, had sounded the alarm during Apache raids and celebrated the end of hostilities. Now it rang with urgent purpose, calling the community to decide whether mercy was a crime worth punishing. Sarah McKenna was the first to respond to the bell's summons, her calico dress billowing in the winter wind as she hurried toward the white clapboard church. As president of the Millbrook Ladies Auxiliary, she had organized relief efforts for widows and orphans, coordinated food drives for struggling families, and maintained the delicate social fabric that held frontier communities together. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the moral complexity of this situation. Behind her came Thomas Henley, the town's blacksmith, his massive hands still stained with soot from his morning's work. He had shod horses for cavalry patrols and repaired weapons used against Apache raiders, but he had also raised 4 children who had never known hunger or desperation. The thought of a baby starving while adults debated politics stirred something primal in his protective instincts. Margaret Foster arrived next, having ridden hard from her practice on the outskirts of town. As one of the few female physicians on the frontier, she understood the challenges of helping people when society's rules worked against compassion. She had treated Apache wounded in secret before, knowing that healing transcended the artificial boundaries that men drew on maps. The church filled steadily as the bell continued its urgent tolling. Farmers abandoned their morning chores, shopkeepers closed their stores, even the saloon emptied as the entire town responded to Reverend Clark's summons. They came with questions etched on their faces and uncertainty weighing heavy on their heart. Reverend Clark stood at his pulpit, his usually gentle demeanor replaced by the righteous intensity that had made him a powerful voice for abolition before the war. The bronze bell finally fell silent as he began to speak, its last echoes fading into the winter air. Friends, we gather this morning not for our usual worship, but because our faith is being tested in ways we never expected. 2 miles from here, good men face punishment for showing Christian charity to a mother and child. The question before us is simple. Will we stand by while mercy is treated as a crime? Martha Caldwell, whose husband had died in an Apache raid 5 years earlier, stood slowly from her pew. Her voice carried the pain of personal loss, but also unexpected strength. Reverend, I've got every reason to hate the Apache. They took my Henry and left me to raise 3 children alone. But I've also got 3 children who might someday need the kindness of strangers. How can I teach them that mercy is wrong when it's offered to someone who looks different from us? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation, but not everyone was convinced. James Morrison, the captain's younger brother and Millbrook's mayor, rose to his feet with obvious reluctance. I understand the Christian impulse to help, but we can't ignore the reality of our situation. These are dangerous times, and coddling our enemies sends the wrong message. My brother has to maintain discipline at the fort, or we'll all pay the price when the next raid comes. The church bell outside began to ring again, this time joined by the bells from the Methodist church across town and the small Catholic chapel on the hill. 3 different denominations united in their call for the community to act, their bronze voices harmonizing in a song of shared purpose that transcended doctrinal differences. Sarah McKenna stood and faced the divided congregation. We've always prided ourselves on being a Christian community. Today we have a chance to prove whether that means anything beyond Sunday sermons. Those soldiers risked their careers to save a baby's life. The least we can do is stand with them. The bronze bell's voice carried beyond the church walls, calling not just the faithful to witness, but challenging an entire community to define itself through its response to those who had chosen compassion over convenience. In the storage room behind the infirmary, McCready sat cross-legged on the floor beside Ayanna, his shackled hands resting awkwardly in his lap. The sound of the distant church bells had reached them through the small window, their bronze voices carrying news of the community's growing involvement in their situation. But McCready was focused on something far more immediate and precious, the small leather journal he had begun keeping to bridge the language gap between himself and the Apache woman. Ayanna pointed to the baby who was sleeping peacefully in her arms and spoke a word in her native tongue. Itsa. McCready carefully wrote the Apache characters as she demonstrated them, his awkward left-handed scrawl filling the page with symbols that looked like art as much as language. Beside the Apache script, he wrote the English translation, eagle. Eagle, he repeated, trying to match Ayanna's pronunciation. His name is Eagle. Ayanna smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he had seen from her since her arrival at the fort. She touched the baby's tiny hand and spoke again. Idzar Nal Nish, she said, then pointed to herself and continued in halting English. His father named too, McCready wrote carefully. Eagle, named for his father. The translation journal was becoming more than a language tool. It was creating a bridge between 2 worlds that had been at war for as long as anyone could remember. Harrison, despite his shackled condition, had managed to fashion a more comfortable sleeping area for Ayanna, using blankets and supplies from the medical stores. He watched the language lesson with growing fascination, occasionally offering corrections to McCready's pronunciation or asking Ayanna to repeat words he didn't understand. The Apache language is remarkably complex, he observed. Each word seems to carry multiple layers of meaning. Ayanna nodded vigorously. Words have, how you say, she gestured with her hands, searching for the English expression. Power, McCready suggested. Yes, words have power. Make things real, she pointed to the journal where McCready had written her son's name. You write Eagle, now he more real to you. The truth of her statement struck McCready profoundly. Until this moment, he had thought of the baby as simply the Apache infant, a problem to be solved or a threat to be managed. But Eagle was different. Eagle was a person with a name, a heritage, a future worth protecting. Sergeant O'Malley shifted position near the door, his own shackles clanking softly. What's the Apache word for friend? He asked. Ayanna considered this carefully before answering. Shukis. She struggled with the English explanation. Not same as white man friend. Apache friend means family you choose. McCready wrote Shukis in the journal, noting her explanation beside it. The word seemed to carry weight beyond its simple translation, implying bonds that went deeper than casual acquaintance or temporary alliance. What about mother? Dr. Harrison asked. Shema. Ayana replied immediately, her voice soft with reverence. Most important word in all Apache language. As McCready recorded this entry, Ayana began to speak more rapidly in Apache, her words flowing like music. Though he couldn't understand the meaning, the emotion was unmistakable. She was talking about motherhood, about the sacred responsibility of raising children in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. She's explaining Apache child-rearing practices. Harrison translated, his medical background having given him more exposure to different cultures. About how children are considered gifts from the spirits, not possessions of their parents. McCready looked up from his writing. Can you ask her to teach us more? About her people, their customs. Dr. Harrison spoke haltingly in Apache, his pronunciation rough but understandable. Ayana's eyes lit up with surprise and pleasure at hearing her language from an unexpected source. She began pointing to different objects in the room, giving their Apache names while McCready dutifully recorded each word. The storage room gradually transformed into an impromptu classroom, with 3 shackled soldiers learning about a culture they had been trained to destroy. "Two," Ayana said, pointing to a cup of water. "Chiz," she continued, indicating a piece of wood from a medical supply crate. "Course," she added, touching the woolen blanket Dr. Harrison had arranged for her comfort. Each word McCready wrote seemed to humanize the Apache people a little more, replacing the faceless enemy of military propaganda with real knowledge about real people who loved their children, respected their elders, and possessed sophisticated understanding of the world around them. The translation journal grew thicker with each exchange, its pages becoming a testament to the possibility of understanding between enemies. In Ayana's patient teaching and the soldiers' eager learning, something unprecedented was taking shape. Not just language acquisition, but the foundation of genuine respect between cultures that had been taught to fear and hate each other. Outside, the church bells continued their urgent tolling, calling the community to witness and action. But inside the storage room, a different kind of revolution was beginning. One conversation, one word, one moment of shared humanity at a time. The blizzard struck Fort Apache with the fury of nature unleashed, transforming the military compound into an island of survival surrounded by an ocean of white death. Snow fell so heavily that the sentries couldn't see beyond their own outstretched hands, and the wind howled like the voices of angry spirits seeking vengeance against all who dared to inhabit their sacred mountains. In the garden behind the officers' quarters, a single rose had been caught by the storm's sudden arrival, its delicate red petals now encased in a crystal shell of ice that preserved its beauty in frozen perfection. The flower had been Martha Morrison's pride, planted 3 years ago when she still believed her husband's assignment to Fort Apache would be temporary, before consumption claimed her lungs and left the captain alone with his rigid sense of duty. Captain Morrison stood at his office window, watching the rose bend but not break under the weight of accumulated ice. The storm had trapped everyone at the fort for 3 days now, soldiers and prisoners alike forced to share the same space, breathe the same air, confront the same elemental threat that cared nothing for military rank or racial differences. The heating system had failed on the second day, leaving only the central mess hall and the infirmary with functioning fireplaces. Morrison had been forced to relocate the Apache woman and her baby to the main quarters, where their presence created an impossible situation that regulations had never anticipated. Private Donovan burst through the office door, snow coating his uniform like powdered sugar. "Sir, we've got a problem with the East Barracks. The roof is failing under the snow load, and we need every available man to shore it up before it collapses." Morrison looked at the shackled prisoners sitting near the fireplace, McCready, Harrison, and O'Malley, their restraints making them useless for the physical labor required to save the barracks. "Sir," McCready called from across the room, "we can help if you remove the shackles temporarily. Extra hands might save lives." Morrison studied the 3 men, weighing military discipline against practical necessity. Outside, the storm raged with increasing intensity, and the sound of creaking timber from the endangered barracks suggested that time was running short. "The regulations are clear about prisoners and their restraints," Morrison replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Ayana stood up from her place by the fire, baby eagle secure in her arms. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her words urgent and insistent. "What is she saying?" Morrison asked. "Harrison. She's offering to help however she can. She says storms don't respect the differences between enemies, and survival requires all hands working together." Morrison looked at the frozen rose outside his window, its icy coating catching the flickering light from the fireplace. The flower had survived the storm by bending without breaking, adapting to circumstances beyond its control. "Sergeant Kowalski," Morrison called to his duty officer, "remove the restraints from our prisoners. We'll need every man for this emergency." The shackles fell away with metallic clinks, freeing hands that immediately began rubbing circulation back into cramped muscles. McCready flexed his fingers experimentally, then stood and faced his commanding officer. "Where do you need us, sir?" "East Barracks, supporting the roof joists. But understand this, Lieutenant. Once the emergency passes, the charges against you all still stand." "Understood, sir." As the men prepared to venture into the storm, Ayana approached Morrison with careful steps. In her free hand, she carried something small wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it to reveal a piece of Apache turquoise carved into the shape of a protective amulet. "For Storm," she said in careful English, offering the amulet to Morrison. "Apache protection. Keep safe." Morrison stared at the blue-green stone, its surface polished smooth by generations of handling. An Apache protective charm, offered to the man who had arrested those who showed her mercy. The irony wasn't lost on him. "I can't accept this," he said quietly. "Not for you," Ayana clarified, pointing toward the window where snow continued to fall. "For all. Storm not care about Apache, white man. Storm kill everyone same." Dr. Harrison watched this exchange with growing amazement. "Captain, she's offering spiritual protection for the entire fort. In her culture, that's an extraordinary gesture of trust and generosity." Morrison looked again at the frozen rose, its beauty preserved but its life suspended in crystalline waiting. Perhaps survival sometimes required accepting help from unexpected sources, even if it challenged everything he had been taught about enemies and allies. He took the turquoise amulet, feeling its warmth against his palm despite the cold that had settled into everything at the fort. "Thank you," he said simply. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the officers' quarters, something had shifted. The frozen rose would survive the blizzard and bloom again when spring returned, but it would be forever changed by the experience of enduring winter's worst alongside those it had never expected to call neighbors. The work on the East Barracks continued through the night, with every able-bodied person at the fort laboring to prevent the collapse that would have left 20 soldiers without shelter in the deadly storm. As McCready hammered wooden supports into place, his sleeve caught on a protruding nail and tore, revealing something he had kept hidden for 3 years, a small silver locket that hung from a chain around his neck. The locket fell open as he worked, spilling its contents onto the snow-covered floor of the barracks. Inside was a tiny photograph, no bigger than a silver dollar, showing a young woman holding an infant. The image was faded and cracked, but the love in the woman's eyes was unmistakable as she gazed down at the baby in her arms. Ayana, who had been passing tools to the workers, despite having baby eagle strapped to her back in traditional Apache fashion, saw the photograph and stopped. She knelt in the snow and carefully picked up the locket, studying the image with the reverence of someone who understood the sacred nature of family portraits. "Your woman, your baby?" she asked in careful English, offering the locket back to McCready. McCready's hands stilled on the hammer, his face suddenly pale despite the cold. He hadn't spoken of Bridget and little Sean to anyone at the fort, couldn't bear to share the story that had driven him from Boston to the frontier in search of something, anything that might make sense of senseless loss. Was, he said quietly, taking the locket with trembling fingers. They died. Fever took them both. Dr. Harrison looked up from his own work, understanding flooding his features. The young lieutenant's desperate need to save Ayana's baby suddenly made perfect sense. He was trying to prevent another tragedy like the one that had destroyed his own family. Ayana touched McCready's arm gently, her dark eyes filled with the sympathy of someone who had also lost everything that mattered. She spoke softly in Apache, her words carrying the rhythm of a mourning song. She says grief is the price we pay for love. Harrison translated, his voice hushed with respect. And that your woman and child live on in the kindness you show to other mothers and babies. McCready closed the locket and tucked it back inside his shirt, but not before Ayana had seen the full truth written in his features. This wasn't about military duty or political ideology. This was about a man trying to save someone else's child because he couldn't save his own. Bridget was my wife, McCready said, his voice barely audible above the storm. We married young, too young probably. Sean was born during the worst winter Boston had seen in decades. He was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, eyes like his mother's. He continued working as he spoke, the physical labor providing an outlet for emotions he had kept buried for too long. The fever came in spring, started with other children in our neighborhood. Poor families, crowded tenements, not enough food or clean water. Bridget was so careful, kept Sean away from other babies, boiled everything he touched. But it didn't matter. Disease doesn't respect precaution. Ayana listened intently, occasionally nodding to show she understood, though the specifics were different. The universal language of parental loss needed no translation. They died 3 days apart, Sean first, then Bridget. She just gave up. Couldn't bear a world without him. McCready's hammer struck the nail with more force than necessary. I buried them in the Catholic cemetery on a hill overlooking the harbor. Graves so small they barely made impressions in the earth. Harrison had stopped his own work entirely, recognizing the therapeutic value of finally speaking these buried truths. Is that why you enlisted? Couldn't stay in Boston. Every street corner reminded me of them. Every baby's cry in the marketplace sounded like Sean. The army offered escape, and I took it. Ayana spoke again in Apache, her words gentle but insistent. Dr. Harrison translated carefully. She says the spirits of your wife and child sent you here to save her baby. That this is how love continues after death, through the kindness we show to strangers who need what we once needed. McCready looked at baby Eagle, secure in his traditional carrier on Ayana's back. The child was alert now, his eyes bright with health that had seemed impossible just days before. In those dark eyes, McCready saw an echo of his own, Sean, the same infinite potential, the same deserving innocence. Maybe she's right, he said finally. Maybe this is how we honor the dead, by protecting the living. The locket pressed against his chest as he returned to his work, no longer a burden of secret grief, but a reminder that love transcends death, that the capacity to care for others can transform even the deepest loss into something approaching redemption. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the barracks, broken hearts were beginning to heal through the simple act of shared humanity in the face of shared danger. The military tribunal convened 3 days after the blizzard ended, in the fort's main assembly hall where a makeshift courtroom had been arranged with precise military efficiency. Colonel Harrison Whitmore had arrived from Territorial Command the previous evening, his weathered face bearing the stern expression of a man who had presided over dozens of courts-martial during his 30-year career. The wooden gavel rested on the improvised bench before him, its polished oak surface reflecting the morning light that streamed through the hall's windows. The gavel had seen service in frontier justice for over a decade, delivering verdicts that ranged from minor disciplinary actions to death sentences for desertion in the face of the enemy. Today, it would determine whether mercy constituted a crime worthy of military punishment. McCready, Harrison, and Sergeant O'Malley stood at attention before the tribunal, their uniforms clean and pressed, despite their recent ordeal. Behind them, the hall was packed with soldiers from the fort and civilians who had traveled from Millbrook to witness the proceedings. The community's investment in the outcome was palpable, turning what should have been a routine military hearing into something approaching a public trial. Colonel Whitmore lifted the gavel and struck it once against the bench, the sharp crack echoing through the silent hall. This tribunal is now in session. We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Lieutenant James McCready, Dr. Marcus Harrison, and Sergeant Patrick O'Malley on charges of insubordination, violation of direct orders, and providing aid and comfort to hostile forces. Captain Morrison stood to present the prosecution's case, his voice steady but lacking its usual conviction. Gentlemen of the tribunal, the facts are not in dispute. These men willfully violated explicit orders regarding contact with Apache individuals. They provided food, medical care and shelter to an enemy combatant and her child, directly contravening territorial regulations. He gestured toward the official orders that lay on the table beside the gavel, the same telegram that had guided his own decisions throughout this crisis. Military discipline requires absolute obedience to lawful orders. To excuse these violations, regardless of motive, would undermine the very foundation of military authority. I recommend the maximum penalties allowed under military law. Colonel Whitmore nodded gravely and lifted the gavel again. The prosecution's case is noted. Does the defense wish to present their arguments? McCready stepped forward without permission to speak, drawing surprised murmurs from the assembled crowd. Sir, I request permission to represent myself and my fellow defendants. Granted, Lieutenant. Proceed. McCready faced the tribunal, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. Gentlemen, we stand accused of showing mercy to a starving mother and child. If that constitutes a crime, then I proudly plead guilty. But I would ask this tribunal to consider what kind of army punishes soldiers for acting with basic human decency. He gestured toward the back of the hall, where Ayanna sat, holding baby Eagle, both of them healthy and alert after days of proper care. That woman came to us, not as a warrior or a spy, but as a mother facing every parent's worst nightmare, watching her child die while having no power to save him. She offered to eat rats if we would feed her baby real food. What kind of men would we be if we turned our backs on such desperation? Colonel Whitmore's expression remained neutral, but McCready noticed his eyes drift toward Ayanna, dear child. The regulations exist for good reason, McCready continued. Military discipline saves lives and wins wars, but those same regulations become meaningless if we use them to justify cruelty toward the innocent. A baby has no political allegiance, no capacity for hostility, no agenda beyond survival. Sergeant O'Malley stepped forward. Sir, if I may add something to the lieutenant's statement. The colonel nodded permission. I've served in this man's army for 20 years. I've followed orders that sent me into hell and back, never questioning, never hesitating. But I've also got grandchildren back home, and I pray that if they were ever in desperate need, some stranger would show them the kindness we showed that baby. Dr. Harrison spoke next, his medical training evident in his calm, analytical approach. From a medical standpoint, this tribunal faces a simple question: is saving a life a crime? My oath as a physician requires me to provide care regardless of politics or military considerations. I cannot apologize for honoring that oath. Colonel Whitmore lifted the gavel again, its weight seeming heavier now. The defense arguments are noted. This tribunal will recess for deliberation. As the gavel fell with finality, the hall erupted in whispered conversation. The wooden instrument of military justice had heard arguments that challenged the very nature of duty and honor, forcing the tribunal to decide whether the letter of the law outweighed the spirit of human compassion. Ayanna watched the proceedings with careful attention, understanding enough to realize that the fate of the men who had saved her child now rested in the hands of military justice and the wisdom of those who wielded it. While the tribunal deliberated, Ayana worked with quiet determination in the storage room that had become her temporary home. Using strips of leather from her own clothing and flexible branches she had gathered during brief supervised walks around the fort, she was crafting a traditional Apache cradle board. A cradle board that would protect and comfort baby Eagle regardless of what the future might hold. The cradle board represented more than infant care in Apache culture. It was a sacred vessel that carried children safely through their most vulnerable months, while connecting them to generations of ancestors who had used similar design. Each element had meaning. The wooden frame symbolized strength and stability. The soft inner padding represented comfort and love, and the protective hood would shield the child from both harsh weather and evil spirits. Harrison watched with fascination as Ayana's skilled hands shaped the wood using only a small knife she had been allowed to keep for practical purposes. Her movements were precise and purposeful, each cut and bend guided by knowledge passed down through countless generations of Apache mothers. "How long does it take to make one of these?" he asked, genuinely curious about the craftsmanship involved. "For my son, whole life," Ayana replied, her English improving daily through constant interaction with the soldiers. "Each mother make cradle board before baby comes. I make his when I carry him, but lost in fire when soldiers came." She paused in her work, her hands stilling as memories threatened to overwhelm her. The original cradle board had been destroyed along with everything else when the cavalry burned her village, leaving her to carry Eagle wrapped only in torn clothing during their desperate flight through the wilderness. "This one different," she continued after a moment. "This one made with hope, not fear." McCready entered the storage room, still wearing his dress uniform from the tribunal. His face was drawn with exhaustion and uncertainty about the verdict that would determine his future in the army and possibly his freedom. "How is Eagle today?" he asked, settling beside Ayana to watch her work. "Strong, getting fat like white man's baby," she replied with a smile, the first attempt at humor McCready had heard from her. The observation was accurate. Eagle had gained noticeable weight during his time at the fort, his cheeks filling out and his movements becoming more energetic. "That's good. That's very good." McCready studied the half-finished cradle board, admiring the intricate patterns Ayana was weaving into the protective framework. "What will happen to him if I'm not here to help anymore?" Ayana's hands never stopped their careful work as she considered the question. "Baby will live, grow strong, maybe become bridge between peoples, like wooden bridge over angry river." "What do you mean?" "Eagle born in time of war, but saved by enemy's kindness. He will remember. Someday when he is man, he tell his children that white soldiers can have good hearts. Maybe his children tell their children. Maybe someday war ends because babies like Eagle grow up remembering mercy instead of hate." The profound hope in her words struck McCready deep. She was crafting more than a cradle board. She was weaving the possibility of peace into the very fabric of her son's protection. "You really believe that could happen?" "Must believe. Without hope, mothers cannot keep going. Gain world tries to kill their babies." Ayana held up the nearly completed cradle board, checking the alignment of the wooden frame and testing the security of each joint. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every element serving both practical and spiritual purposes. In Apache way, cradle board protects baby's spirit as much as body, keeps soul safe during time when child cannot protect self. She looked directly at McCready. "You and Doctor and Sergeant, you like human cradle board, protect Eagle when his own mother too weak." The metaphor resonated powerfully with McCready, who had been struggling to understand his own motivations for risking everything to help a stranger's child. Perhaps Ayana was right. Perhaps they had all served as protectors during Eagle's most vulnerable time, just as this cradle board would shield him in the days ahead. "What if the tribunal finds us guilty? What if we're sent away?" Ayana smiled and continued her careful weaving. "Then Eagle remember you always, and when he becomes father, he makes sure his children's safe too. Kindness like seeds. Plant today, grow tomorrow. feed many people for long time. She finished the last intricate knot and held up the completed cradleboard. It was a work of art, as much as a practical infant carrier, beautiful enough to hang in a museum, but sturdy enough to protect a baby through whatever challenges lay ahead. Perfect, McCready breathed, admiring the craftsmanship. No, Iana corrected gently, nothing perfect, but made with love, and love makes strong enough. As if summoned by their conversation, baby Eagle began to fuss in his makeshift bed. Iana carefully lifted him and placed him in the new cradleboard, adjusting the soft padding and securing the protective ties. Eagle settled immediately, his dark eyes bright and alert as he gazed up at his mother from his traditional bed. For the first time since arriving at the fort, both mother and child looked ready to face whatever the future might bring. Colonel Whitmore returned to the assembly hall with the gavel heavy in his hand, and a verdict that would reshape the lives of everyone present. The packed hall fell silent as he took his position at the makeshift bench. The weight of military justice and human conscience balanced precariously in his weathered features. "This tribunal has reached its decision," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform. "The defendants will rise." McCready, Dr. Harrison, and Sergeant O'Malley stood at attention, their faces composed, but their futures hanging in the balance. Behind them, Iana held baby Eagle in his new cradleboard, the infant alert and healthy, living proof of the mercy that had brought these men before military justice. "Lieutenant McCready," Colonel Whitmore began, lifting the gavel, "you are found guilty of violation of direct orders and insubordination. However, this tribunal recognizes the extraordinary circumstances that led to your actions and the humanitarian nature of your motivations." The gavel struck once, its sharp crack echoing through the silent hall. "You are hereby reduced in rank to 2nd Lieutenant and reassigned to Territorial Headquarters, effective immediately. Your service record will reflect both the violation and the commendable compassion that motivated it." McCready's jaw tightened, but he maintained military bearing. The demotion was significant, but not career-ending. Colonel Whitmore had found a way to uphold military discipline while acknowledging the moral complexity of the situation. "Dr. Harrison," the colonel continued, "you are found guilty of violation of territorial regulations regarding aid to hostile forces. However, your actions were consistent with medical ethics and your oath as a physician." Another strike of the gavel. "You will receive an official reprimand in your service record, but you will retain your position as post surgeon. This tribunal recognizes that medical care transcends political boundaries and that saving lives should never be discouraged, even under difficult circumstances." Dr. Harrison nodded slightly, relief evident in his shoulders as the tension left his frame. He would continue his work at the fort, chastened but not destroyed by his choice to honor his medical oath above military regulations. "Sergeant O'Malley," Colonel Whitmore said, his voice softening slightly, "your 20 years of exemplary service weigh heavily in this tribunal's consideration. You are found guilty of insubordination, but your actions reflected the kind of moral courage that the army should cultivate, not punish." The gavel fell for the 3rd time. "You will forfeit 2 weeks' pay but retain your rank and position. Furthermore, this tribunal recommends you for commendation for distinguished service during the recent blizzard emergency, where your leadership helped save the East Barracks." O'Malley's Irish features broke into a slight smile. The old soldier had survived worse storms than this tribunal, and his career would continue unblemished. But Colonel Whitmore wasn't finished. He set down the gavel and looked directly at Captain Morrison, who had been sitting rigidly throughout the proceedings. "Captain Morrison, this tribunal finds your handling of the initial situation to have been technically correct, but lacking in the kind of moral flexibility that effective frontier command requires. While your adherence to regulations is commendable, your failure to recognize the extraordinary humanitarian circumstances shows a concerning rigidity." Morrison's face flushed, but he remained silent. Therefore, you are hereby reassigned to administrative duties at Territorial Headquarters, effective in 30 days. Command of Fort Apache will transfer to Major Patterson, who has demonstrated both military competence and the kind of nuanced judgment required for effective frontier leadership. The gavel struck one final time, and McCready felt a mixture of shock and satisfaction. Captain Morrison's rigid interpretation of military zeal had cost him his command, while the men who had chosen mercy over regulations emerged with their honor largely intact. As the hall erupted in whispered conversations, McCready looked down at his torn uniform where the lieutenant's bars had been ripped away during the verdict. The fabric was damaged but not destroyed. Much like his military career, he would continue serving, albeit at reduced rank. But the experience had taught him that some things mattered more than advancement or official recognition. Ayana approached him after the crowd began to disperse, baby eagle secure in his traditional cradle board. She reached into her medicine pouch and withdrew a small piece of thread, a strand from the fabric she had used to create the cradle board. "For your uniform," she said in careful English, offering him the thread. "Apache way to mend what is torn, but still strong." McCready took the thread, understanding the symbolism. His career had been damaged by his choice to show mercy, but it could be repaired. More importantly, it could be made stronger by the wisdom gained through standing up for his principles. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for saving my baby." Now Eagle grows up knowing that enemies can become friends when they choose love over hate. As McCready carefully tucked the Apache thread into his pocket, he realized that some torn things, when properly mended, became more beautiful and resilient than they had been before the damage occurred. 2 weeks after the tribunal, the first green shoot of spring pushed through the snow beside the fort's main gate, its tiny emerald blade defying the harsh winter that had gripped the territory for months. The small plant was barely visible, no more than an inch tall, but its appearance marked a fundamental shift in the world around Fort Apache. Winter was ending, and with it, the desperate circumstances that had brought Ayana and baby Eagle to their gates. Harrison discovered the shoot during his morning rounds, the small sign of life catching his eye as he stepped carefully around the patches of melting snow. He knelt beside the fragile plant, marveling at its resilience and the perfect timing of its emergence. After months of death and dormancy, life was asserting itself with quiet determination. "Remarkable," he murmured to himself, then looked up to see Ayana approaching with Eagle secure in his cradleboard on her back. "New life," she observed, in English, settling beside the doctor to examine the tiny plant. Apache word is hozo, when things come back into balance. That's a beautiful concept, balance. Ayana nodded, watching as Eagle's bright eyes tracked the movement of her hands. Amaidia nodded, watching as Eagle's bright eyes tracked the movement of her hands. Major Patterson, the fort's new commanding officer, approached with a measured stride that spoke of confidence tempered by wisdom. He had arrived the previous week to assume command from Captain Morrison, bringing with him a reputation for fair dealing and practical solutions to frontier problems. "Mrs. Ayana," he said formally, having learned to pronounce her name correctly, "I wanted to discuss your future plans now that the weather is improving." Ayana stood respectfully, adjusting Egg's position in the cradleboard. The question of what would happen to her and her son had been carefully avoided during the tribunal proceedings, but spring's arrival made decisions unavoidable. "Apache scouts report your people have established a new settlement 60 miles north of here," Major Patterson continued. "They're willing to provide safe passage if you wish to rejoin them." The offer represented everything Ayana had hoped for during the dark winter months. Reunion with her surviving people, the chance to raise Eagle among his own culture, freedom from the suspicious glances of soldiers who still saw her as a potential threat. But as she looked around the fort that had become an unlikely sanctuary, she felt the complexity of choices that seemed simple on the surface. "My people," she said carefully, "they accept baby and mother back?" "According to the scouts, yes. They understand the circumstances that brought you here. Dr. Harrison watched this exchange with growing concern. Eagle still needed medical attention that would be impossible to provide in a nomadic Apache camp, and Iana herself was still recovering from the ordeal that had nearly killed them both. Major, a medical standpoint, both mother and child would benefit from continued care here. The baby's development is progressing well, but he's still vulnerable to setbacks. Major Patterson nodded thoughtfully. Unlike his predecessor, he seemed willing to consider factors beyond strict military protocol. "What would you prefer?" he asked Iana directly. She looked down at the green shoot pushing through the snow, its determination to survive and grow despite harsh conditions. The tiny plant represented possibility, not just for spring, but for new ways of thinking about old problems. In Apache way, mother always choose what best for child, not what she want for herself, Iana said slowly. Eagle born in winter of war, but saved by kindness of enemies. Maybe he's supposed to grow up learning both ways. Apache and white man. Maybe that how peace grows, like small plant in hard ground. The profound implications of her words weren't lost on Major Patterson. Here was a woman proposing something unprecedented, allowing her child to be raised with knowledge of both cultures, creating a bridge between peoples who had been enemies for generations. "Are you saying you'd consider staying at the fort permanently?" "Not permanent, but maybe until Eagle old enough to choose for himself. Maybe until he's strong enough to walk between two worlds without falling." Dr. Harrison looked again at the green shoot, understanding Iana's metaphor perfectly. Like the plant that required both soil and sunlight to thrive, Eagle might need exposure to both cultures to fulfill his potential as a bridge between worlds. "It's an interesting proposal," Major Patterson mused, "though it would require approval from territorial command." "Spring coming," Iana observed, gesturing toward the tiny plant. "Time for new things to grow. Time for old ways to change." As if to emphasize her point, Eagle gurgled happily from his cradleboard, reaching toward the green shoot with tiny fingers that seemed eager to touch the promise of new life emerging from winter's air. The Apache delegation arrived at Fort Apache 3 days later, their approach announced by the rhythmic beating of drums that echoed across the prairie like thunder from a distant storm. Leading the group was an elderly man whose weathered face bore the dignity of a lifetime spent navigating the treacherous waters between war and peace. In his gnarled hands, he carried a ceremonial peace pipe, its carved bowl decorated with symbols that spoke of sacred intentions and hopes for understanding between former enemies. Major Patterson stood on the fort's wooden platform, watching the delegation approach with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Unlike previous Apache contacts that had been marked by suspicion and barely contained hostility, this group rode with the measured pace of diplomats rather than warriors. The peace pipe visible in the elders' hands suggested possibilities that military regulations had never contemplated. "Iana," Dr. Harrison called softly, "your people are here." She emerged from the infirmary where she had been helping tend to a soldier's injured leg, her skills with traditional healing proving valuable even in the fort's medical practice. Baby Eagle rode secure in his cradleboard, alert and curious about the commotion surrounding the approaching riders. The delegation stopped 30 yards from the main gate, close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid any appearance of threat or aggression. The elderly leader dismounted slowly, his movements careful but dignified, and walked forward with the peace pipe held prominently before him. "I am many horses," he announced in English that was heavily accented but clearly understood. "I come to speak for my people about the woman and child you have protected." Major Patterson descended from the platform, recognizing the historical significance of this moment. Never in the fort's history had Apache representatives come openly for diplomatic purposes, seeking dialogue rather than demanding action through force. "I am Major Patterson, commanding officer of this fort. We welcome your peaceful approach and your willingness to talk rather than fight." Many horses nodded approvingly at the major's respectful tone. He raised the peace pipe and spoke words in Apache that carried the rhythm of prayer and the weight of ceremony. Though most of the soldiers couldn't understand the language, the sacred nature of his words was unmistakable. "I ask the spirits to bless this meeting," he translated, "to help us find path that honors both people's needs." Ayana approached the elder with obvious respect, speaking rapidly in Apache as she explained the circumstances that had brought her to the fort. Many horses listened intently, occasionally asking questions that drew detailed responses about her treatment by the soldiers and the current health of her child. "The woman tells me you have shown great kindness," many horses said to Major Patterson. "This surprises my people. We are not accustomed to mercy from soldiers." "Perhaps it's time for new customs on both sides," Patterson replied carefully. The elder smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth that any soldier at the fort had seen from an Apache representative. He held up the peace pipe, its carved surface catching the afternoon sunlight. "This pipe was made by my grandfather's grandfather, has been used to make peace with Comanche, with Navajo, with other Apache bands, never before offered to white soldiers." The significance of the gesture wasn't lost on Patterson or the soldiers who had gathered to witness this unprecedented meeting. The peace pipe represented generations of Apache diplomacy, a sacred tool that had resolved conflicts and forged alliances throughout the Southwest. "We are honored by your offer," Patterson said formally. Many horses looked directly at Ayana, speaking in Apache with the gentle tone of an elder offering wisdom to a younger relative. Her responses were thoughtful, occasionally glancing toward Baby Eagle as if considering his future in her decision-making. "She has told me of your proposal," many horses said to Patterson, "that the child might grow knowing both ways of life. This is unusual, but these are unusual times." He paused, studying the faces of the soldiers who had risked punishment to save an Apache baby. In their expressions he saw something that challenged everything his people had learned about white men during decades of conflict. "My people have debated this question since we learned of her situation. Some say she should return immediately, raise the child as pure Apache. Others say the spirits guided her to this place for reasons we do not yet understand." The peace pipe seemed to pulse with significance as many horses held it between himself and the major, a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for as long as anyone could remember. "I propose something that has never been tried," the elder continued. "Let the woman and child remain here for one full cycle of seasons. Let us learn if peace can grow between our peoples the way corn grows in good soil, slowly, carefully, with patience and hope." Major Patterson felt the weight of history pressing down on this moment. The decision he made here could reshape relations between the Army and the Apache, creating either a foundation for lasting peace or a dangerous precedent that his superiors would never forgive. That evening, Major Patterson sat alone in his quarters, turning over in his hands a peculiar medallion that had been given to him by his predecessor as part of the fort's unofficial traditions. The two-sided coin was roughly the size of a silver dollar, worn smooth by decades of handling. On one side was carved the eagle and shield of the United States Army, representing duty, honor, and unwavering loyalty to military command. On the other side, etched by some long-forgotten soldier, were Apache symbols, a sun, mountains, and a running horse, representing the land, the people, and the freedom that defined the territory they all shared. Previous commanding officers had used the medallion to make difficult decisions, flipping it when regulations provided no clear guidance and conscience offered no easy answers. Tonight, Patterson found himself in exactly such a situation, facing a choice that could define the future of Apache military relations for generations to come. The medallion's weight seemed to shift between his fingers as he considered many horses' unprecedented proposal. Allowing Ayana and Eagle to remain at the fort, as cultural ambassadors would require approval from territorial command. Approval that seemed unlikely, given the Army's current policies toward Apache peoples. Yet refusing the offer might destroy the first genuine opportunity for peace that had emerged in decades of conflict. A soft knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. "Come in." McCready entered, still wearing his second lieutenant's bars with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned that rank mattered less than character. In his hands he carried the translation journal that had become a bridge between languages and cultures during the winter crisis. "Sir, I wanted to share some thoughts about the Apache delegation's proposal, if you're willing to listen." Patterson gestured to a chair, grateful for counsel from someone who had actually worked closely with Ayana. "Please, sit. I could use your perspective." McCready opened the journal, its pages now filled with hundreds of Apache words and their English translations, along with cultural notes that revealed the depth of understanding that had developed between the soldiers and their unexpected guests. "Sir, I've been thinking about what many horses said, about this being a chance to see if peace can grow like corn in good soil. The metaphor is more accurate than he might realize." "How so?" "Corn doesn't grow wild, sir. It requires cultivation, patience, and constant care. You can't plant it and walk away. You have to tend it every day, protect it from threats, provide what it needs to thrive." McCready flipped through pages of carefully recorded conversation. This journal represents months of daily cultivation, small conversations that built trust, understanding that grew from shared experiences. Patterson examined the journal's contents, noting the evolution from simple word translations to complex discussions of cultural values and beliefs. The progression told a story of gradual understanding that challenged everything he had been taught about the impossibility of Apache military cooperation. "You think the peace proposal could work?" "I think it's worth trying, sir, but only if we're prepared to put in the same daily effort that created these relationships." McCready paused, choosing his words carefully. "The medallion you're holding, I've heard about it from other officers. Maybe it's time to stop flipping coins and start making choices based on what we've learned rather than what we've been told." Patterson looked down at the medallion, its two sides representing the divided loyalties that had defined frontier military service for decades. Apache symbols on one side, military insignia on the other, two worldviews that had seemed mutually exclusive until a starving mother and her baby had forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions. "The risk is enormous," Patterson said quietly. "If Territorial Command disapproves, both of our careers could be finished. Sir, with respect, some things matter more than careers. That baby is thriving because people chose to do what was right instead of what was safe. Maybe it's time for the Army to make the same choice." Through his window, Patterson could see the Apache delegation's campfire, where many horses and his companions waited patiently for a decision that would affect not just Ayana and Eagle, but the entire relationship between their peoples. The firelight flickered against the darkness, a small beacon of hope in a landscape that had known too much conflict. "If we do this," Patterson said finally, "there can be no half measure. Would be committing to a completely new approach to Apache relations, one based on mutual respect rather than military dominance." McCready nodded. "That's exactly what makes it worth attempting, sir." Patterson closed his fingers around the medallion, feeling its dual nature, military duty on one side, human understanding on the other. For the first time in the fort's history, those two loyalties might finally point in the same direction. The choice before him was no longer about flipping a coin between competing obligations. It was about having the courage to forge a path that honored both the responsibilities of command and the possibilities of peace. 6 months later, baby Eagle took his first steps across the wooden floor of the fort's main assembly hall, his tiny feet moving with the unsteady determination that marks every child's journey toward independence. The moment occurred during the weekly cultural exchange meeting, where Apache visitors and fort personnel gathered to share knowledge, trade goods, and slowly build the foundation for lasting peace. Ayana knelt at one end of the hall, her arms outstretched encouragingly, while Dr. Harrison sat at the other end, with a broad smile lighting his weathered features. Between them, Eagle tottered forward with the focused concentration of a child discovering his own power to navigate the world. "Come on, little man," Harrison called softly, his hands ready to catch the baby if he fell. "Show everyone how strong you've become." Eagle's first steps represented far more than a developmental milestone. In the months since many horses' peace proposal had been cautiously accepted by territorial command, the baby had become a living symbol of possibility, proof that even those born in the darkest circumstances could thrive when surrounded by love and understanding. McCready, now serving as the fort's liaison to the Apache community, watched from nearby with quiet pride. The translation journal he had started during the winter crisis had grown into a comprehensive guide to Apache English communication, used by soldiers and civilians throughout the territory who were learning to interact peacefully with their former enemy. "He's walking toward the future," McCready observed to Sergeant O'Malley, who had become Eagle's unofficial grandfather figure during the peaceful months. "Aye, and carrying all our hopes with him," O'Malley replied, his Irish accent thick with emotion. The baby's progress across the room drew applause from the assembled crowd. Apache elders, military personnel and civilians from Millbrook who had traveled to witness this weekly miracle of cooperation. Among them sat Sarah McKenna from the Ladies' Auxiliary, who had organized supply drives to support the cultural exchange program, and Thomas Henley, whose blacksmith skills had been essential in creating tools and implements that both communities could use. Many horses sat in his customary place of honor, his ancient eyes bright with satisfaction as he watched Eagle navigate between two worlds with the fearless confidence of childhood. The old warrior had become a regular presence at the fort, serving as cultural advisor and helping to smooth the inevitable misunderstandings that arose when peoples with different traditions attempted to build trust. "In Apache way," many horses said to Major Patterson, "child's first steps very important. Show what direction his life will take." "And what direction do you see for Eagle?" Patterson asked. "He walks from Apache arms to white man's arms, then back again. This is path of peace, moving between peoples, carrying understanding like medicine between communities that need healing." Ayana finally caught her son as he completed his journey across the room, lifting him high in celebration, while Eagle laughed with the pure joy that only children can express. The sound filled the assembly hall with something that had been missing from Fort Apache for decades: hope for a future defined by cooperation rather than conflict. Dr. Harrison approached mother and child with the medical bag that had become familiar to both Apache and military families. Eagle's health had improved dramatically during his time at the fort, but regular checkups continued to ensure his continued growth and development. "Strong heartbeat, clear lungs, excellent reflexes," he reported after a brief examination. "This young man is ready to take on the world." "Both worlds," Ayana corrected gently, her English now fluent after months of daily interaction with the fort's personnel. "Eagle will grow up knowing Apache wisdom and white man's learning. Maybe someday he help others find balance between different ways of living." The weekly meetings had become the cornerstone of the peace experiment, providing structured opportunities for cultural exchange that had gradually expanded beyond simple diplomacy. Apache knowledge of desert survival and traditional medicine had proven invaluable to military operations, while Army medical care and supply systems had improved life for Apache families willing to participate in the exchange program. As Eagle settled into his mother's arms, content from his successful journey across the room, the assembled crowd began to disperse with the quiet satisfaction of people who had witnessed something historically significant. The baby's first steps had carried him between two communities that had been enemies just months before, proving that the future could be shaped by courage, compassion, and the innocent trust of children who knew nothing of the hatred that had divided their elders. Major Patterson made a final note in his official log, recording not just Eagle's developmental milestone, but its symbolic importance for the ongoing peace process. In years to come, historians would mark this moment as the beginning of a new era in frontier relations, the day when hope learned to walk, carrying the promise of understanding from one community to another, with the fearless determination of childhood taking its first independent steps toward tomorrow.